Take that hat off! Now! The command cracked through the sterile air of Terminal B like a gunshot. The line jolted, passengers freezing mid-step, heads turning as the voice rang out again, sharper this time, serrated with authority and something colder. At the front of the line stood an elderly man. His posture was straight, but not rigid, more the quiet strength of someone who had once held a line others thought would break. He didn't move, just blinked slowly behind gold-rimmed glasses. The soft olive of his worn military cap tugged low over his brow. The badge on the young officer's chest caught the overhead lights as she stepped closer. She pointed at the cap again, lips curled. I said, take it off. It's procedure. Now. The man's fingers twitched at his side, not from fear, but something older. He lifted his chin gently. His voice came low, calm, almost apologetic. This cap's not just a cap, ma'am. The officer scoffed. I'm not here for stories. Remove it or step aside. A child behind him clutched his mother's hand, whispering, "Why is she yelling at Grandpa?" An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the line, like wind brushing through wheat just before a storm. He still didn't move. A pilot, tall and composed, stepped slowly away from Gate 12. His gold insignia glinted beneath his navy lapel. He didn't speak, not yet, but his eyes fixed on the old man, not with pity, but with recognition. And in that moment, the cap still on, the line still frozen, the question hung unspoken in the air. Who is this man? And why does that cap matter so much? If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Earlier that day, the apartment was still when the morning light pushed through the slatted blinds, laying golden stripes across the worn wood floor. George Allen moved slowly, not from frailty, but from ritual. Each motion had weight, memory, and a quiet reverence behind it. He folded the towel he had used to dry his face with military precision, creases aligned just so, then set it gently on the radiator to dry. The kettle clicked off with a soft metallic sigh. Steam rose from a chipped white mug, curling into the air above the kitchen table. George stirred in 1 spoon of honey, the same way he had done for years, ever since his late wife told him it soothed the chest on cold mornings. He never liked it, not really, but he still did it. Habit. Tribute. Across the room, an old bookshelf sagged slightly in the middle, burdened by photo albums, folded flags, and a single framed black and white photograph of 3 young men in uniform, arms slung around one another, mouths caught mid-laugh. George looked at it for a long moment, eyes pausing on the one in the center, the smallest of them, Jamie Reese, the one who didn't make it home. Outside, the city stirred. Tires on wet pavement. A dog barked in the distance. George buttoned his olive green shirt slowly, smoothing the fabric over his chest before reaching for the cap that hung from the coat hook by the door. It was faded now, the stitching worn thin at the seams, but it still held its shape. He brushed it off with his palm and placed it gently on his head, adjusting the brim just slightly. There was no mirror near the door, but he didn't need one. He knew how he looked. Straight-backed. Presentable. And that cap, it wasn't for style. It was armor. George checked the time. Flight 802 to Atlanta. It had been 13 years since he'd boarded a plane. Airports weren't made for men like him anymore. Too fast, too loud, too impersonal. But today wasn't about comfort. Today was about keeping a promise. He stepped into the hallway and locked the door behind him. Down the block, the corner grocery store was half lit and half empty. George moved through the aisles with the patience of someone used to being overlooked. When he placed his items on the counter, just a small pack of gum and a bottled water, the young man behind the register didn't look up. He barely scanned the items before tapping the total into the machine. "You got Apple Pay?" the clerk asked, already looking past him. George reached into his wallet and pulled out a $10 bill, unfolding it carefully. The clerk sighed, took the cash, and made change without a word. Outside, the bus hissed as it pulled up to the curb. George stepped toward the doors as they opened with a mechanical whine. The driver, a woman with tired eyes and headphones dangling from her neck, barely glanced up. "Seen your fare," George said gently. She jerked her chin toward the reader. "Just tap it." George fumbled slightly with the transit card. The machine beeped. He moved slowly to the seat behind the driver and sat down, adjusting his bag beside him. No one looked at him. No one smiled. At the next stop, a man in a business suit stepped onto the bus, talking loudly on the phone. He shoved past George's seat without an apology, the corner of his briefcase bumping George's knee. George didn't flinch. He just looked out the window. The sky was soft gray, low clouds rolling in like a tide. In his chest, a quiet rhythm pulsed, not dread, not sadness, something older, a drumbeat of duty. At the airport entrance, the automatic doors opened with a gust of cold air. George stepped inside, his boots making soft thuds on the polished tile floor. Travelers moved past him in streams, dragging wheeled suitcases and clutching coffee cups. He stood still for a moment, taking it in. Overhead, a garbled announcement called for final boarding at Gate 23. George glanced at the screen. His gate, Gate 12, was further down, past security. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder bag and stepped forward, boots echoing softly in the cathedral hush of the terminal. Security lines stretched ahead like coiled wire. He joined one near the end, his posture calm, his face unreadable. 2 rows over, a young mother struggled to keep her toddler from crawling under the barrier ropes. A businessman checked his watch, sighing audibly. George didn't sigh. He waited. The cap remained on his head. From the front of the line, a sharp voice rang out. Not angry, not yet, just officious. Next. George took a step forward. The next moments would change everything. The line moved slowly, inching forward like a reluctant tide. George stood quietly between a couple whispering in Spanish and an elderly woman in a bright pink visor. A humming from the fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly in his ears. It smelled of waxed tile, luggage, and stale coffee. He held his documents in one hand, boarding pass, license, everything in order. When his turn came, he stepped forward without hesitation. Behind the security table stood a young officer in a crisp blue uniform, her hair pulled tightly into a regulation bun. Her badge caught the light, and the sharp lines of her posture matched the sharpness in her voice. She didn't greet him. She just extended her palm and gestured toward the cap on his head. "Remove your hat." George blinked, not in confusion, but in calculation. He'd been through checkpoints before. Some asked, some didn't, but never like this. He offered a gentle smile, calm and composed, the way a man does when he's long stopped expecting kindness, but still chooses to return it. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "this cap isn't just something I wear. It means something." She didn't flinch. "Sir, I'm not here for speeches. You're obstructing facial recognition protocols. Remove it." He hesitated, just a moment, barely a breath. But that pause seemed to ignite something in her. She raised her voice slightly, just enough to draw the attention of the next few people in line. Her eyes sharpened. "You're delaying the process. Remove your hat." "Now," the murmur began. Subtle. A man clearing his throat behind George. Someone shifting their bag impatiently. The familiar heat of embarrassment crawled up the back of his neck. But still, he didn't remove the cap. "It belonged to a friend," George said gently, his voice as steady as a distant drum. "A Marine who never got the chance to come home. He asked me to carry it for him. I've carried it every day since." The officer crossed her arms. "That's not relevant here." "It is to me." Her hand hovered near the radio on her shoulder. "Sir, this is a federal checkpoint. If you continue to refuse, I will have to escalate this as non-compliance." George's fingers rested on the brim of the cap. He didn't raise it. He didn't lower it. His hand just lingered there, like someone remembering how to let go of something they've held onto for too long. A woman further down the line stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but clear. "He's a veteran," she said. "You can see it in his posture. Just let him through." The officer turned on her. "Ma'am, this is not your concern. Stay back." The woman recoiled, stunned. George's eyes met hers briefly, and he nodded with a faint, weary smile. She gave a small nod in return before shrinking back into the crowd. The tension in the room coiled tighter. A child asked again why the man was being yelled at. Another woman in line pulled out her phone and began to record, her lens aimed but uncertain. The officer's voice grew louder. "You are holding up federal operations. I'm giving you one last warning. Remove the hat, or face consequences." George took a slow breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he's not afraid, but knows what's coming will be hard. He reached into his coat pocket and calmly removed his identification. He placed it on the table with both hands. His fingertips trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the reverence of the moment. This wasn't just about a cap anymore. It hadn't been since the first demand. "George Allen, United States Marine Corps, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, Vietnam, 1971. The officer glanced at the ID. No change in her expression. "I'm calling backup," she said, already pressing the button on her radio. "We have a non-compliant subject at Station 3. Possible disruption." A second officer arrived quickly, a security staff member, taller, bulkier, wearing a utility vest and a rigid expression. He took one look at George, who stood as still as granite, and moved his hand casually toward the holster at his side. Not to draw, but just to remind. The gesture did not go unnoticed. George lowered his eyes, not in submission, in memory, and still, he did not remove the cap. The rain had not let up in 2 days. It came in waves, first a soft hiss, then a drumming roar that blurred the jungle into a smear of green and red. George Allen crouched low beneath the weight of his gear, boots sunken deep in the soupy mud of the Vietnamese lowlands. His breath came in bursts, short and sharp, fogging the underside of his helmet. Every part of him was soaked, uniform clinging like a second skin, sweat mixing with the monsoon, the faint metallic smell of blood lurking in the air. To his right, Corporal Jamie Reese shifted slightly, wincing. He had taken shrapnel just below the ribs, and though he tried to keep his face composed, George could see the color draining from it. There were 5 of them pinned in a shallow depression beneath a ridge. The high ground ahead was crawling with enemy movement, shadows weaving through the trees like ghosts. "We can't stay here," George whispered, voice barely audible beneath the patter of rain and the distant thump of mortars. "We hold, and we bleed out." Jamie chuckled, his laugh low and ragged. A poetic way to say we're screwed. George pressed a bandage harder into Jamie's side. "You're not dying here, you hear me?" Jamie's response was a groan, part pain, part protest. Then came the call over the radio, crackling, nearly unintelligible, but clear enough. "Air evac inbound. 5 minutes. Mark with flare." George glanced at the flare gun strapped to his belt. Firing it would give away their position, but if the chopper couldn't see them, they were done. He looked down at Jamie, then across to the others. One wounded in the leg, another barely holding onto his rifle. The third, Private Esteban, no older than 19, was praying under his breath in Spanish, lips moving like a child counting rosary beads. "I'm going," George said. "Keep your heads down." Before anyone could stop him, he slung his rifle over his back, clenched the flare gun in one hand, and darted forward into the trees. Mud sprayed behind his boots. He ran low, heart hammering like artillery in his chest, until he found a small ridge where the tree line broke. There, under the skeletal remains of a burned-out tree, he fired the flare. A hiss. A trail of red light arcing into the rain. Seconds passed, then gunfire. George hit the ground hard, bullets stitching the air just inches above him. He crawled back, ducking behind fallen logs and roots, ignoring the sting of branches and the bark that tore at his knuckles. By the time he made it back to the group, the chopper was already circling overhead, blades pounding the air like thunder. The first rope dropped. George helped the others first. Private Esteban, then the wounded rifleman, then the leg injury. He turned to Jamie last. Blood soaked the front of his shirt now, his face pale and slick. "I can't make the climb," Jamie murmured. "You know that." George didn't argue. He knelt, pulled Jamie's arm over his shoulder, and stood. The weight nearly buckled him, but he gritted his teeth and began dragging them both through the sucking mud toward the rope. It felt like a lifetime. The noise was deafening. Blades, gunfire, shouting, and in the middle of it, the low, rasping breath of a dying man. They reached the line. George latched it around Jamie's waist first. He gripped the other side and gave the signal. The hoist began. Halfway up, Jamie's head leaned into George's shoulder. His lips pressed close to George's ear. "You carry this home for me," he whispered. George blinked in confusion. Jamie tugged at his helmet, then pulled something from the breast pocket of his shirt. A cap, olive drab, standard issue, frayed at the edges from months in country. He shoved it into George's hand. "You make it out. You remember me." By the time the chopper cleared the ridge, Jamie was already gone. George held on to that cap the whole ride back, blood still on the brim. He never wore it until the funeral, never took it off since. The terminal was still humming, but the tone had shifted. What had started as a routine checkpoint had taken on a tension no one could quite name. Cameras were raised, but low, unsure. A child clutched his mother's arm. Someone muttered about missing a connection, but no one stepped forward. Not this time. George stood unmoved. The brim of the cap stayed exactly where it had been when he entered. The silence he carried seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Across the room, beyond the stanchions and tired travelers, a man in pilot's blues began to walk. His stride was not hurried but certain, like someone long accustomed to being where he was needed without having to rush. His name tag caught the light, Captain Thomas Bradley. The gold wings on his chest gleamed beneath his navy coat. Silver at his temples, posture crisp, but not stiff. He wasn't just in uniform, he wore command. He passed the last row of chairs without pause. The TSA agent, Ramsey, still standing rigid at her station, narrowed her eyes as he approached. "Sir, you'll need to step back. This is a controlled—" Captain Bradley held up one hand, not rudely, just enough. It wasn't a request. It was habit. The room quieted. Even the radios on the officer's shoulders seemed to fade. "I'd like a word with this gentleman," he said, voice even, unwavering. Ramsey didn't move. "You're not cleared for security intervention. Step back, or I will report." He ignored her entirely and turned to George. "Marine," he said. George didn't react at first, but when he looked up, it was not at the uniform or the face. It was at the insignia pinned beneath the collar, a small circle of gold with 5 stars and a pair of wings. A fellow veteran. Bradley's voice softened. "Name and service?" George's throat bobbed once. He took a breath and met the man's eyes. "George Allen, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, Vietnam, 1971. A pause. Then Bradley gave a nod, slow and deliberate. A man seeing another man. Not a passenger, not a delay. A brother. Bradley straightened. "Captain Thomas Bradley, United States Air Force, Desert Storm, retired." They saluted, not ceremonially, but from the soul. The movement was slow, personal, neither for show nor the cameras that were now definitely rolling behind them. The TSA officer stepped forward again, her tone cracking now with something between frustration and doubt. "This man has refused to comply. He's being recorded. Bradley turned toward her. "You're shouting at a decorated combat veteran for wearing a memorial cap." She opened her mouth, closed it. The second security officer behind her glanced down and shifted uncomfortably. Bradley didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words pressed into the air like thunder muffled beneath clouds. "Some uniforms don't come off, officer. Some hats aren't worn. They're carried." More people began to gather now. Gate 11's boarding call went largely ignored. A man in business attire lowered his phone. An elderly couple stopped walking, the woman clutching a boarding pass with trembling fingers. Something unseen had passed through the space, like the silence in a chapel just before prayer. A young woman stepped from the crowd and asked gently, "Is he really a veteran?" Bradley turned slightly, but his voice still addressed everyone. "This man served in the jungles of Vietnam, in a unit that took 70% casualties. He dragged a fellow Marine under fire to a medevac point, refusing to leave him. He came home carrying the cap of the man he couldn't save." Then, more quietly, "And he's been carrying it ever since." Ramsey looked at George again. Truly looked this time. Her brow twitched. Her jaw worked, but nothing came out. George stood still. But now, he wasn't alone. Captain Bradley stepped closer to George, closing the distance not with urgency, but with reverence. The space between them seemed to shrink, but the silence around them grew heavier, more deliberate. George remained still, though something in his eyes had softened. The hardness of his jaw eased. The line of his shoulders released ever so slightly, as though the weight of memory were no longer his alone to carry. Bradley turned to the crowd, not with grand gestures or commands, but with the gentle gravity of someone who had spoken in hangars and over fallen men. His voice carried, not loud, but far. This man saved lives in a war many tried to forget. He didn't come home to parades. He came home to silence, and he's been carrying one name with him ever since: Jamie Reese. That name, and the cap Jamie wore on the last day of his life. The crowd around the checkpoint had doubled, then tripled. People from other gates, airline staff, custodians. Even a young man in earbuds had pulled them out, his gaze fixed on the veteran in front of him. George didn't look around. His eyes had gone somewhere deeper, somewhere back to the jungles of 1971, to the red flare against rain, to the weight of a friend's last breath. Then came the movement, quiet at first. A child, perhaps 10, stepped from his mother's side. He stood a few paces away from George and slowly lifted his hand in a salute. His palm was open, his fingers awkward, but the sincerity in his eyes needed no correction. George turned his head slightly, his breath catching. He gave the boy a nod, barely emotion, but full of gratitude. A woman in her 60s wearing a United States Navy ball cap took off her hat and placed it over her heart. Behind her, a man did the same. Then another, and another. One by one, the terminal changed. Caps removed, heads bowed, hands to hearts. Even the soft murmur of the airport had gone still. No chatter from the intercom, no rolling suitcase wheels. Only the gentle hush of people remembering something bigger than their own travel plans. Bradley turned to Ramsey. She stood motionless, lips parted, her expression tangled in the threads of uncertainty, embarrassment, and something else. Perhaps a dawning awareness that this moment would follow her far beyond this shift, far beyond this terminal. "He's not refusing," Bradley said gently. "He's remembering. And now we are too." Ramsey's throat worked. She glanced down, then back up. Her voice, when it finally came, had lost its edge. I didn't know." George spoke for the first time since Bradley had arrived. His voice was soft, weathered, but resolute. "None of us ever really know, ma'am, until someone makes time to ask." Tears clung to the corners of his eyes, not from pain, not even from shame, but from the ache of finally being seen. He reached up and adjusted the brim of the cap, not to remove it, to honor it. "I promised him," George said, "and I've kept that promise every single day." Bradley stepped beside him. Together, they faced the growing crowd. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't applause. It was deeper than that. A reverent stillness, the kind that filled church pews and military funerals. A collective breath held in sacred quiet. And then, like a wave cresting, the sound returned. Soft clapping. No one led it. No one demanded it. But it came anyway, rising like rain after drought. Not thunderous, not theatrical, just real. George Allen blinked once. His mouth opened slightly as if to say something, but instead, he just looked skyward. A single tear escaped. He did not wipe it away. He looked at the cap in his hand, then closed his fingers around it, lips moving so faintly that only Bradley, standing close, could hear. "Thank you, Jamie." The story spread before the sound of the applause even faded. It moved in waves, through phone screens, into social feeds, whispered in gate lounges, and replayed in break rooms behind the scenes. No one could agree on exactly what had been said, or when the first hat came off, but one thing became clear. Something real had happened at Gate 12. By the end of the day, footage from the checkpoint appeared on 3 news networks. No faces were blurred, no names were hidden. Captain Thomas Bradley stood shoulder to shoulder with George Allen in every frame. His voice calm as he spoke of sacrifice, of memory, of dignity too long ignored. By the next morning, a formal statement came from the airport authority. The press release included words like regret, respect, and honor. But the phrase that mattered most came at the bottom. Effective immediately, all veterans wearing recognized military insignia will be exempt from removal of headgear during identity confirmation. No small print, no legal hedging. Just policy, rewritten in full. Officer Ramsey wasn't fired. That wasn't how it was handled, but she was removed from field rotation. It was quietly announced that she had begun veteran sensitivity training, a new program developed in coordination with the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. She didn't fight the reassignment. She didn't file grievance. Instead, she asked a quiet question before leaving the floor that day. "Can someone tell me where Jamie Reese is buried?" No one answered her out loud, but later that week, she was seen at the National Cemetery, cap in hand, walking alone between the rows. At the airport itself, near Gate 12, something new appeared. A bronze plaque, inset into the wall just to the right of the security checkpoint. Simple, unadorned. It bore no name, only the inscription, "To the ones who never took off the uniform, and the ones who carried it for them." Beneath the plaque, a bench was installed. People sat there between flights. Some took photos. Others just sat in silence, their hands folded, watching the ebb and flow of travel as if something sacred still hovered in the air. Online, the story became a seed of something more. Comments flooded in. Veterans posted their own photos with caps and medals, sharing names of the friends they carried. Sons and daughters wrote of fathers they had never truly understood until that video. Teachers showed it in classrooms. Pastors referenced it in Sunday homilies. It wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. As for George Allen, he declined all interview requests, politely, every time. He returned home without ceremony, slipping back into the quiet rhythm of his days, as if the world hadn't just turned its gaze for a fleeting second in his direction. But those who paid attention noticed something subtle had changed. At the corner store, the young clerk offered a slow nod when George came in. At the bus stop, the driver greeted him with a quiet, "Morning, sir," and didn't rush him aboard. And in his apartment building, the neighbor who once mocked the cap now held the elevator door open. Twice. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't medals or headlines. But it was something. It was respect. The sun broke low over the horizon, pouring soft amber across the grass, as though the morning itself had paused to whisper. The cemetery was quiet, not in the way empty places are, but in the way sacred ground knows how to breathe with the names it holds. George Allen walked slowly between the rows. The path beneath him was gravel, familiar in its crunch, measured in steps he had taken many times before. He carried no bouquet, only the cap. The wind played gently at his collar, tugging the edge of his coat. In the distance, birds stirred the air with faint song, and the flag above the memorial wall flapped once, then settled again. The world, for once, seemed willing to wait. He stopped before the grave. The stone was simple, just like Jamie had wanted. No grand title, no long inscription, only the name. Corporal James R. Reese, United States Marine Corps, 1950, 1971. For a while, George said nothing. He simply stood, eyes low, hands folded around the brim of the cap. His shadow stretched across the grass like a tether, touching the edge of the stone. When he finally knelt, it wasn't with the slowness of age, but with care. He placed the cap gently on the headstone, smoothed it flat. His fingertips lingered there, tracing the threads as though each fiber still held Jamie's voice, Jamie's laugh, Jamie's blood. "I carried it," he said softly. "Everywhere." The breeze shifted. A few yellow leaves skipped across the path behind him. "You made it home through me. Now you rest." He reached up and straightened his own shoulders, adjusted his collar. Then, slowly, he raised his right hand to his brow in a final salute. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no onlookers, just two old friends, one standing, one sleeping. George rose, wiped a hand across his cheek, and turned away. As he walked back through the rows, a flock of birds lifted from the trees. The sky had opened fully now, blue as the sea they once crossed. The gravel crunched beneath his boots. A rhythm, a retreat, a promise fulfilled. At the gate, he paused. One last look over the shoulder, one last whisper to the wind. "Semper Fi, brother." Then he stepped forward, into the day. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the next story now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.